Greetings, life forms. This terrarium is about a year and a half old. It is doing great, but it is a little bit overgrown. The ficus is popping out the top. The moss is doing great, but will soon overtake everything. And the turtles, well, the turtles speak for themselves. Now, while this is not absolutely necessary at the moment, in a bit the terrarium is gonna get overcrowded. Now, it's very important to give each and every one of them the space needed to grow. If one or more are crowding the space, it limits the others, usually causing either browning or a degree of die-off, which I would like to avoid. First, we start by carefully removing the turtles, or the string of turtles, scientifically known as Peperomia prostrata. You know I love my Latin. I move each of them one by one. They're very delicate life forms, so I'm careful not to rip them out. Next, I have to remove the moss. And this is actually my favorite part of redoing terrariums. It smells like the forest after a light rain. That smell, weirdly enough, is one of the smells that humans are very sensitive to, which is why we can smell the rain or water from miles away. We are actually more sensitive to that smell than sharks are sensitive to the smell of blood and water. One by one, I move each and every little moss pillow. And they are doing great, very healthy, green, and growing. Next, I have to remove the variegated creeping fig. A lot of the leaves, or some of the leaves, have very heavy variegations. I then remove what is left of the moss, including this cool moss-covered rock. After removing everything and cleaning the container, I keep the flora life forms hydrated. They were in a closed terrarium, so bringing them out in the open means they're gonna lose a lot of the moisture and ambient humidity. Next, I add the drainage layer, Leica balls. I get a Gigantosaurus bag of Leica balls from IKEA of all places. It's actually quite cheap and works great. It's also used as a growing medium for hydroponics. You will notice this layer is significantly thicker than the layer that was in the terrarium before. Now, the thicker the false bottom layer is, the healthier I find the substrate and the plants are. This is because it gives more room for water to pool in before recycling back up into the terrarium. I create a slope using this aquascaping tool. This gives me more surface area to plant. I then add the substrate barrier, a plastic window screen mesh. This helps keep substrate out of the false bottom and keep water out of the substrate. Window screen mesh is slightly larger than the terrarium circumference itself. That way it creates an upwards lip, aiding in preventing the substrate from going into the false bottom. This is the step where I like to add my cleanup crew. Tails of spring, or springtails if you will. If you are adding a charcoal layer, I would recommend using some of your springtail charcoal. Usually because it's activated charcoal if you purchase the springtail from a pet store, and it might also contain some springtail eggs. I then add some extra black sand to the front of the terrarium. Because it is sloped, the black sand sort of acts as an even finer barrier between the substrate and the false bottom. I then grab my handy tiny shovel in order to place the substrate in the terrarium. Now, this substrate is the classic ABG mix, or the Atlanta Botanical Gardens mix, usually made from 1 part potting soil, 1 part sphagnum moss, 1 part sand, and 1 part leaf litter. I purchased a pre-prepared mix from Critters Jungle in Ottawa. They add quite the few other things, such as cuttlebone for calcium, which is extremely beneficial not only to the plants, but to your cleanup crew, as they need calcium to create their exoskeleton, and it just contributes to the overall health and the mineral content of the soil. This particular mix also contains some worm castings. If you do have some earthworms, they contribute greatly to the bioactivity of a terrarium, but not these small terrariums. As the space is limited, they end up eating more of the plants than is necessary. After sloping the substrate itself, I start adding the bits of hardscape. The rock, which I had to remove some of the moss from, goes first, as this is the main piece of hardscape. Next, I have a little piece of spider wood. This wood particularly tends to mold up quite quickly in a terrarium environment, but I find that, a couple of weeks with a good active cleanup crew helps remove that mold right out, which is also why it's important to add a cleanup crew to all of your terrariums. After the hardscape is done, this is what I have so far. All the hardscape elements are placed within the golden ratio, or the rule of thirds. I then add some white sand to the foreground. I do this before planting or before putting in any of the moss because it's really fine sand and tends to just go everywhere, and I just wanted to create some sort of beachfront-ish. It also aids greatly in reflecting some of the light back up the terrarium, which helps all of the plants grow. Now it's time to place the moss back again. I start by cutting off the bottom portion of the moss. This is because it's usually the dead moss and material that's otherwise not needed and will take up quite a bit of space without contributing anything to the environment. I also like to trim the moss, or take some time to trim the moss. This gives me extra moss, and you know how I love moss. So having extra is always nice. I tend to propagate cuttings like this within the same terrarium, so everything goes back to where it was. It also helps reshape the tufts of moss, if you will. Remove the browning or undesirable areas and leave the colony of moss, colony of moss looking way healthier. One by one, I give the moss a little hair trim. Also, while trimming the moss, you get that awesome forest smell. You know the one I'm talking about. I then carefully place the moss back in and nestle it in between the rock, the spiderwood, and in general areas of interest. This is what the terrarium looks like after I'm done. I am particularly fond of this variegated creeping fig. I don't really need to tell you why, because just look at it, it's so beautiful. And huzzah! Terrarium is all better, everything has space and place to grow. I will not be placing turtles or Peperomia prostrata in this particular terrarium because the turtles grow way too fast and tend to overtake all of the other vining plants and moss. If you found this video helpful or learned something new, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button, so this video can spread to more people. Thank you, dearest life forms.